a warm welcome for Sandra, and thank you for coming to Hector Firehouse.
Well, hi, everybody. I am your neighbor. I live up in Trumansburg in Ulysses Township, and I speak a lot about fracking all over the country, and it's a great honor and a pleasure to speak in my own backyard. Hector became an important place for us when my husband and I, with our family, first moved from Boston to this area. We chose the Hector Meeting House, the Quaker Meeting House, called the Hector House, as our place of worship. And so I feel a special kinship here. I'm a biologist. I've studied environmental health for the past 20 years. That's my field of study. But unlike Joe, I actually didn't get involved with the issue of fracking until about 2 years ago. I was aware of it, but I felt like it wasn't part of my purview. What I typically do is to take a look at toxic chemicals and their ability to cause chronic health problems, in particular cancer or reproductive disorders. And so in my mind, fracking was an energy issue, and I didn't really deal with energy, so I left it for other people to do until a couple of years ago when I began to realize that some of the same chemicals that I had been intensely studying for the past 2 decades are actually deeply bound up with fracking, and so I began to look at it seriously. So much so that this past year, when I became one of the lucky recipients of a Heinz Award, I made the big decision, as you heard, to donate the cash prize that came with it, $100,000, to the anti-fracking movement here in New York. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that story in a bit, but I wanted to start off by saying that of the many awards that I've received as a biologist, that one I think means the most to me because the man who gave his name to that award, John Heinz, was a Republican senator from the state of Pennsylvania, and I grew up in a deeply Republican household in Illinois. My father died a few years ago, but that would have been the medal that I would have wanted to show to my dad, because I grew up in a household where the word conservation and the word conservative was understood to share a common root, and that was also the spirit of John Heinz, I think, and it's a spirit that is rare, more and more rare, that I hope we can somehow bring back. So with that, what I'd like to do first is to start off by telling you a little bit about the geological history of the Marcellus Shale. And I'm going to cover some of the same ground that Joe did, perhaps with just a little different language. I know that when it's easy to feel like you walked into the middle of the movie with hydrofracking, because it is a complicated process. And by the time it captures each of our individual attention, a lot of the people who are talking all around us may be, on chapter 12, and we're still on chapter 2. And so I just want to do some basic explanation of the history of the Marcellus Shale area, which I think will help us understand why regulating the risks is not sufficiently protective. And that's going to be my main point tonight, that there are the risks, of which there are many, from hydrofracking are not, we can't regulate it away. There's no way of doing this technology right. So let's start 400 million years ago, when the place that we are all sitting now was the bottom of an ancient ocean. And this was a very still ocean and a very shallow ocean, and that we would be on the northern edge of it. So the north shore of this ocean was up just north of us around Syracuse. And it extended all the way down to where West Virginia is now. And the eastern shore would be where the Catskill Mountains are now. And then it would go west all the way to Ohio. So this was this ancient ocean. And there was a mountain range that existed where the Catskill Mountains are now. Those mountains have entirely gone. They eroded, and they eroded into this shallow sea. And dust changes its name. When it's in water, we now call it silt. And so all the sediment from that mountain range then eroded into this ocean and fell to the bottom. And along with it came all kinds of things that mountains contain. So the whole periodic chart is inside mountain ranges. So that includes a lot of radioactive elements like radium and strontium, uranium. It includes a lot of heavy metals like barium, lead, mercury, arsenic. And those things, too, with that silt, eroded into this ocean and fell to the bottom. All right, now, 400 million years ago was a very different time in our Earth's history. It wasn't as oxygen-rich atmosphere, and there were fewer land plants. And so the water at the bottom of that ocean was very oxygen poor. Also, the creatures who lived here, this is way before mammals. It was way before even fish. So there was nothing with a backbone, there was nothing with breasts, there's nothing with a four-chambered heart that lived in this ocean. There were things like sea lilies and squids. And when they died and fell into this oxygen-free ocean bottom, their bodies would not decompose the way they would now. And instead, they turned into bubbles of methane, which is what natural gas is a euphemism for, right? And so methane is really simple. It's just a carbon with some hydrogen atoms around it, and it's a gas. And so in all this silt, with all these heavy metals and radiation, then formed tiny bubbles of methane. So I think of it as a kind of petrified fizz of champagne bubbles that got trapped inside the silt. And then with years and years of pressure, all of that silt then was pressed into the rock that we call shale, which we know very well, right? Because we see it everywhere here. Every time you go into one of the gorges, the foundation of my own basement, I live in a 100-year-old house, and the foundation is made of the stuff, and my sidewalks and so forth. And so this is the rock. This is the bedrock of where we live. This is our basement rock. And so about a mile below our feet then is this layer that represents the old ocean floor. It's about 200 feet thick, and it has all these tiny, as Joe said, sort of microscopic bubbles of methane. And that's the quarry for fracking. We want to get those bubbles out. But unlike the old gas wells, which were basically like cocktail straws that we could stick into the ground and capture a large pocket of methane, because those tiny bubbles all flowed and formed one giant bubble that got then trapped under some other layer. We've pretty much run through all those pockets now. Starting in 1821, the very first gas well ever drilled in all of North America, drilled right here in our state in Chautauqua County, when somebody stuck a hollow log down into one of these pockets of methane and then was able to light up this kind of whole community. And it was a big deal at the time. Tourists came to take a look at how you could turn on the lights by natural gas. But until fracking, we were running out of all these giant pockets. We were burning through them all, and there weren't many left. And so all throughout the whole U.S., natural gas production was on the decline until we rolled out fracking, which allows us now to go in and blow up the bedrock and make those tiny bubbles come up to the surface. So let's just review how that's done again. So as Joe explained, we're going to drill down all the way till we intersect this Marcellus Shale, and then we're going to turn the drill sideways, and then like a robotic mole, it's going to tunnel along for another mile or two. And then what we're going to do is take water and use that as a club to kind of smash the bedrock into shards so that all those little bubbles that are trapped inside it can be freed up to go along the horizontal pipe and then up the vertical pipe. And because it's lighter than air, it's going to naturally want to rise. Well, if you just used water, it's not going to work for a couple of reasons. One, it's too much friction. You can imagine when a layer of shale is a mile or more below the ground, you have a lot of what's called lithostatic pressure, just the weight of the earth. So to try to blow up a formation that far into the ground, you need a tremendous amount of force. And specifically, you need 15,000 pounds per square inch, which is roughly the force of swinging a baseball bat against a windshield. And so to exert that amount of force down a 5-inch or so borehole, there's too much friction. So you need to add chemicals to the water to make it slick. That's why it's called slick water horizontal hydrofracking. And so then by adding chemicals to reduce the friction, then you can exert the kind of pressure that you need. But even that isn't going to actually work, because as soon as you release the pressure, which you need to do so the gas bubbles flow up, all those cracks that you opened up are just going to close up, because the weight of the earth is just going to, once again, close everything up, and the gas won't be able to escape. So you need to blow something in the cracks that you made to hold them open. And what you're going to use is sand. And not just any kind of sand, because most sand isn't strong enough to be stronger than lithostatic pressure. You need silica sand. And that's a specific kind of sand that's mined where I come from in Illinois, along the river valleys. So in the Midwest, in Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, we're strip mining sand and loading it up into rail cars and bringing it to the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania, or it's going north to North Dakota, which is another hotbed of fracking. That's the Samson of sand grains, is silica sand. And the health risks for fracking really begin there, because silica sand is a carcinogen. It's a lung carcinogen. It's like asbestos, and unlike tobacco smoke, when you inhale it, it's a very sharp and tiny particle that triggers lung cancer, not by mutating your genes the way tobacco smoke does, but as asbestos does, by triggering inflammation. Because you have a particle that's caught, and you just get inflammatory processes that eventually put cells on the pathway to tumor formation through chronic inflammation. So one of the side tragedies triggered by fracking is what's going on in the sand counties of the Midwest, where there is a parallel sand rush to meet the demand for fracking. And so we see people in Wisconsin leasing their land to the mining companies, only this time, once you strip mine, then you're done. So pretty much people sell and move out. But for the people who remain, now they suddenly look out their window and they can see huge sand dunes where there was once a hillside, right? And we've never exposed the general population to silica dust before, so we actually have no data to say what effect that would have on the general population. We have plenty of data on workers, because people who operate sandblasters are exposed to silica sand, and we know it's a lung carcinogen, so we regulate it very tightly. There's legal limits to how much silica dust you can be exposed to as a sandblaster. But the general population has never been exposed to appreciable amounts of crystalline silica before, so there are no regulations for us. So we have no data on what it does to the developing lungs of a child, or how it affects pregnancy outcome, and so forth. And because there are no regulations, it's completely allowed to go forward, right, without anyone measuring or trying to control the silica dust that's in the air of these communities. So one of my favorite places in this world, Starved Rock State Park, which is the state park that I grew up as a child, is now the land just on the boundary of the park has been leased out for strip mining frac sand. And so it occurs to me that the beloved landscape of my childhood is about to be loaded onto rail cars and shot to the center of the earth of the beloved landscape of my children's childhood here over top the Marcellus. So the health risks are not just confined to the gas fields. I guess that's the first point that I want to make, because it makes me feel, as a resident of this place, responsible not just for my own health and for the health of my own children, which that's my job as a parent, to protect my children from harm, but also to realize that the land is being turned inside out in other people's homeland as well. And the kind of energy that I'm burning in my house is related to children somewhere in Wisconsin who are losing their habitat. All right, so let's go back to the borehole. If you just added water with slickeners and sand and added a lot of pressure, that still isn't going to work to frack, because it turns out that the Marcellus Shale is not just a graveyard of methane bubbles that used to be living creatures from 400 million years ago. It's also a living ecosystem now. There are living things that live down there at that depth, which is a fairly new discovery within the field of geology. We used to believe that the biosphere, the living part of our planet, really was confined to the sunlit surface, with a few notable exceptions like those deep sea vents, right, where funny gases come up from at the very bottom of the ocean, even though it's very black down there, and you have all these creatures living in this total darkness down there. But other than those strange exceptions, we've always believed that you needed sunlight and photosynthesis for food chains to run, but not so. As it turns out, there are many creatures. Some of them are bacteria, and some of them are from a domain of life very separate called archaea that can live in deep geological strata. And they form complex communities, so it's a living ecosystem down there. So I've come to think of the Marcellus as a kind of subterranean coral reef, if you will. And these creatures then run very differently than, their energy systems are very different than what we see around us here at the surface. Some of them are able to run on radioactive decay. Some of them feed on hydrogen sulfide gas. And some of them are able to use the hydrocarbons that are down there. And so the problem for the oil and gas industry is that these relic organisms, and remember it's warm down there because you're far enough down that we're talking about not exactly boiling water, but like the temperature of bath water, right? So these organisms are going to grow in your pipes, especially because to get those sand grains shot into the cracks that you've created, both through the explosives and through the hydraulic pressure, you have to carry the sand grains around the bend using something thick, right, like guar. It's almost like the medium that you would use in a petri dish. And then, of course, you have to add another chemical to thin all that stuff out once the sand grains are where you want them to be, because if all that fluid stays thick, then the bubbles won't travel back up the pipe through them. So first you make it very viscous and thick to get the sand grains around the bend and into the cracks, and then you add what are called breakers to thin all that stuff out again so the gas bubbles can flow. But all those thickeners are a really good medium for bacterial growth, not only because there are native species that are alive in the rock, but also because, remember, as Joe said, you're using around 4 million gallons of water to frack with, and if you take all that water from rivers and streams, and lakes, which is where most of it comes from, there are living creatures in the water that you've siphoned it up from, and you're shooting living creatures down to this very warm place, and they're going to reproduce. So the oil and gas industry calls this biofouling, and so it means that living creatures are sheathing the inside of the pipes and interfering with the flow of gas. So the solution to that problem is to add biocides, very powerful poisons, basically pesticides that kill everything alive. Very, very powerful poisons that are poured down the hole that are going to kill off the organisms in the lake water or the organisms that naturally inhabit the rock. So this is the point I wanted to get to then, to explain why fracking is inherently toxic. You use very powerful poisons in order to frack. And there are very powerful poisons already in the rock that are then going to come back up. So let's now that we've got the sand grain shot into the cracks and the organisms killed off, now let's release the pressure and let everything flow back up the hole, all right? So during that process, the gas comes up, and about half of the water that you shove down into the rock is going to come back up, and that's called flowback. The other half, as Joe pointed out, is trapped in the rock permanently. So we're making a big chunk of the water, a big portion of the water just disappear altogether from the hydrologic cycle. And in that way, you can think of fracking as a sort of hostage exchange program. So we're exchanging water for gas. So the water will fill the place in the rock that the gas used to occupy, and that allows the gas bubbles to flow up. About half the water comes back. And since it takes 4 to 9 million gallons of water to do a single frac job, we're talking about millions of gallons of very toxic fluid that's going to come back. So first of all, that fluid's going to contain all the chemicals that you added, the guar, the biocides, the stuff to reduce friction and so forth, and the sand. But also, while it was down there in its journey to the center of the Earth, it's picked up all kinds of other things that are naturally occurring in the shale. And those are those heavy metals and radiation and all that brine, the original seawater that's now so concentrated it's 4 to 5 times more toxic than ocean water. So all that's now mixed up with your original fracking water, and that's also going to come back up. So here then is another Achilles heel of this industry that is a problem that hasn't been solved. What are we going to do with all that flowback? There is no technology to turn it back into drinkable water. And, okay, so I'm going to say that again because I want to be very clear. We actually could roll out a technology that would turn it back into drinkable water, but it would require so much energy. It would require all these condensers and distillers that it would not be profitable, and it would add hugely to the greenhouse gas footprint of gas. So if you weren't convinced already that natural gas is not much better than coal in terms of protecting our climate, if you were also required as a drilling company to return the water that you use that comes back, the flowback fluid, into potable water, you would really have a fuel that is less green than coal because of all of the energy that would go into separating out all of the contaminants from the water. So because we're not doing that, the question is, how do we contain all of this toxic flowback that is now permanently contaminated? So I began to think about how much quantity we're actually talking about. And so when you take a look at the figures offered by the draft environmental impact statement, the so-called SGIS, that is the planning document for fracking, and you look at the number of well pads that are planned and the amount of water that will flow back from each one of them, and just kind of do some simple math, it turns out we're talking about 65 billion gallons of flowback, which is equivalent to the amount of water that flows over the Niagara Falls for 35 straight hours. So if you can imagine standing in front of the Niagara Falls and that kind of flow rate for 35 hours, that's the kind of volume we're talking about. And remember, it's radioactive, it's full of heavy metals and salt, and it's lethal. So how are we going to contain this forever? Where are we going to put it? And the best solution of all the many that are offered, from just dump it on the roads to put it in an open pit to run it through our sewage treatment plants, the best solution is to take it to Ohio and shove it into the ground in Ohio because Ohio has, especially in its northeast quadrant, has a form of bedrock that's not like shale. It's permeable. And when you can, under high pressure, inject fluid into that rock, and it will spread through the rock, and the rock will contain it. And so that's where much of the flowback fluid from Pennsylvania is already going. And you may know that the U.S. Geological Survey has now definitively linked the injection of flowback fluid into Ohio's geological strata to the swarm of earthquakes that it experienced there between March 2011 and January 2012. And we feel like we understand the reasons for that now because, remember, there are all these siliconers, right, to reduce friction. And so when you re-inject it, you lubricate a lot of the underground rocks. And so sometimes what prevents rocks from slipping is just that there's a lot of friction and they're stuck next to each other. But if you lube them all up, they're going to now slide more easily past each other. And so you can induce seismic activity through the injection of frac fluid. So I can tell you, having just lectured recently in Northeast Ohio at Kent State, Stark County, which is at the epicenter of where these injection wells are, that people are just absolutely frantic about this because they're not only enduring leasing and upcoming fracking activities, but they're on the tailpipe end, they're on the receiving end of all of this waste that's coming at them from all over and experiencing these earthquakes. And their roads are filled up with trucks. Even before fracking begins, the roads are filled with trucks, 18-wheelers, hauling radioactive lethal materials. They're teaching their teenage children to drive on these, rural back roads. And I never saw so many people weeping in any of my audiences as I did in Ohio. So again, as a mother who lives in a place that's in the crosshairs of the gas industry, who feels like my job is to protect my own children, I began to think, well, not only I'm doing this work to stop fracking, not only for us here, but for the people where I grew up who are experiencing all the silica sand dust, which is at the beginning stages of fracking, right? We have to mine the sand first before we can begin to frack. But also for the people who are at the receiving end of all the waste that it's generated. So this is a technology that tears up the earth and triggers earthquakes, not just where it happens, but across a huge swath of our nation, and is, from an ecological point of view, is changing the face of the earth. All right, so let's go back then. So now, remember, we're at the point where all the flowback is coming up, and eventually we put that into a pit, or we haul away the waste in some way, and now the gas begins to flow up. What else is coming up with the gas? Well, it turns out that there are many other gases that are trapped in the shale. It's not just methane. So when all those creatures died, they didn't only turn into methane. About 80 to 90% of them was methane. But depending on the pressure and the temperature, they turned into other gases as well. So there are all these other what are called native gases trapped in the rock, including things like butane, propane, ethane, benzene, toluene, and so forth. And some of these are very toxic. And so these are also liberated along with the gas and come up with the gas. And so part of the job of bringing the gas to market is to separate out all of the other gases from the methane. And that's done through these process of condensers and compressors and so forth. And they also leak. So it's not just methane that leaks, it's things like benzene. And that's what caught my attention originally, because benzene is something I know a lot about in my work in carcinogenesis. Benzene is a known cause of leukemia. Benzene is a known cause of birth defects. And it does so at very tiny, vanishingly small concentrations. There's no level of benzene that you can breathe that I can say you're below the safe threshold level. It doesn't matter. It's negligible. Benzene is one of those things like radiation that there's no safe amount of exposure. We know from studies that have been done out west that in the Barnett Shale, for example, in Texas, that in some cases you see benzene leaking in around 93% of wells. So let's back up again and talk about the problem with these gases and how they're trapped in the shale. As long as you don't break the shale up, they're a mile down there. They don't really come up to bother us, except for radon, right? So we all have to pay attention when we buy and sell our houses, and if we have children, what the radon level in our basement is. So we know that there are things that are coming up from the bedrock that can insinuate themselves into naturally occurring fissures and get into our basements and so forth. But other than radon, mostly, as long as we leave the bedrock alone, nothing in it is going to find its way up to us in the surface until we blow it up. But remember, before, and Joe eloquently explained how we put these cement and steel casings on to make a well. But remember, before that happens, you're simply drilling a well, right? You're drilling a hole from the surface a mile down through our aquifers. And it takes a while, once that hole is drilled, to get the steel in there, to get the cement poured and up and around. And during that whole time, there's an open hole allowing all those gases, methane, benzene, toluene, whatever's down there, to come straight up, and it does. So Theo Colburn, my colleague who lives in Colorado, an endocrinologist and a wildlife biologist, is documenting the fugitive emissions at all stages of the drilling and fracking operation. And her main message to us is that it's not just during the time of fracking that you're getting air emissions. It's through the whole life cycle of the process. And again, that's not regulatable. There's nothing we can do to prevent. If you drill a hole and there are volatile gases, they're going to come up. You're going to get leaks, right? You can reduce them and try to capture some of them, but you can't get them all. So even the best regulations that have been put forward, we're talking about maybe capturing up to a third, but most of them are not going to be captured, even with regulations. The other reason that regulations don't really protect us is, remember, we need 4 to 9 million gallons of water to frack a single well. We also need all that millions of pounds of sand. We need tens of thousands of gallons of chemicals. How is that going to get to the well pad? Well, it has to be brought in by truck. So we're talking about more than 1,000 truck trips for every well. And we're talking about 60 to 70,000 wells in New York State. So that's a number, the number of additional truck trips is a number with 6 zeros after it, at the very least. And just the diesel exhaust from the truck traffic alone will lay down a blanket of smog across upstate New York. And what do we know about diesel exhaust? Well, we actually know quite a lot. We know that it's related to asthma in children. We know that it's related to a heart attack and stroke risk in older adults. Brand new studies show that it's actually related to cognitive decline among older women. So older women who breathe crummy air because they live on busy roadways. That's the equivalent of aging your brain by 2 years. And so you see increased memory loss, perhaps even resulting in dementia, although the data, some people claim it. I'm not convinced yet by those data, but it certainly doesn't look good for an older brain to be in a body that's breathing in bad air. You get the kind of plaques and damage that is associated with Alzheimer's disease due to inflammation. It's also related to preterm birth, which is our #1 cause of disability. So we actually have the ability to run these numbers. And this is my main argument with Albany right now, is that we know so much about air pollution. We know that if you increase the increment of ground level ozone or carbon black or nitric oxides by X amount, that you will increase by Y amount the number of childhood asthma, stroke, heart attacks, and so forth. And we also know that with every preterm birth, with every kid with asthma, we know how much that costs. These numbers have been generated. So for example, with asthma, it's an $18 billion a year medical cost to take care of children with asthma. In California, they figured out how much asthma is actually caused by exposure to traffic exhaust. And in 2 cities alone, it came to $18 million. We know that children with asthma miss 5 days of extra school a year. Asthma is the #1 cause of school absenteeism, #1 cause of emergency room visit. We know that parents of children with asthma miss 4 extra work days a year. So there's a hit on worker productivity and so forth. And so we can generate all the direct and indirect costs of heart attack, stroke, preterm birth, asthma, and run the numbers. And then we could say, well, here's what the costs would be to New York if we opened our doors to fracking, just from the air pollution from the trucks alone. We have the ability to do that, but the state isn't doing it, right? And so how can we say that the revenue stream and the jobs, and we'll get this big economic boost from fracking if we're doing a cost-benefit analysis, you have to do the costs as well as the benefits. And so healthcare cost, is one of the things both individually that cause us to go bankrupt. So it's a chronic healthcare problem can be impoverishing to a family, but also to a state. It can add to our Medicare costs and our Medicaid costs and so forth. And so understanding the economics of the healthcare problem is one of the impacts of fracking that has not been addressed by the state of New York. So I'm going to close here because I know you might have questions, and I'll say to answer the question I began with, rhetorically, I guess, about why I gave the Heinz Award to the anti-fracking movement. I'll say that as a cancer patient myself, I was diagnosed with bladder cancer at the age of 20. I grew up in a blue-collar community just downwind from 30 different industries. And I'll never know if the fact that I had bladder cancer by the time I was 20 has to do with the fact that my hometown drinking water wells were contaminated with the solvent perchloroethylene, which is dry cleaning fluid, which is a bladder carcinogen. I'm a sample size of 1, so as a biologist, I don't know if that is the cause or not. I can tell you that children shouldn't grow up drinking dry cleaning fluid. I can say that that's what my diagnosis is what triggered my decision to go on into environmental health rather than go on into medical school. And I can say that I will do everything in my power as a biologist and a mother to make sure that my own children don't become data points in a cancer registry because we couldn't figure out a better way to turn on the lights. I think there are solutions to our energy problem. I don't think fracking is the solution. And so far, our federal government is unable to regulate fracking because, as Joe pointed out, it specifically was exempted from federal laws. And so our federal government doesn't have much regulatory power over this process. There's not a lot of things in this world that are legal, that you would take a poison like a biocide, a human carcinogen, and pour it down a hole in the ground. That would be a crime under most circumstances. So in order for this even to be legal, you have to lift the usual laws that apply to other industrial activities. And so that leaves it up to the states to regulate. But as Joe mentioned, that part of the Department of Environmental Conservation's job is to promote energy extraction and then also regulate it. And so it seems to be conflicted. And then where does that leave us citizens? Well, that leaves our towns, right? That leaves our local communities whose job it is to look out for the well-being of the residents and our economic development. And happily, I think the good news here is that everything's on our side. The science is on our side to show that this is harmful. I feel confident about that. The economics appears to be on our side because it looks like we would destroy as many jobs as we would create, and the healthcare costs themselves are going to be ruinous. And also the future is on our side because the best science shows us that we could, in fact, convert to renewable energy and entirely run our nation's economy on it if we were able to reduce our consumption by half. That's the trick, right? But this too should be doable because the Germans have already done it. They have half the per capita energy consumption that we do. The Japanese have already done it. And so rolling out a truly ingenious and innovative solution to our energy problems would get us to where we need to be, and rather than kick the can down the road so that our children finally have to make the leap into renewables. After all, we're talking about a fossil fuel, right? I mean, which is by definition is non-renewable, as in God's not putting any more of it in the ground. So it's going to go away at some point anyway, maybe 5 years, 20 years, 100 years. Somebody's going to have to make the leap into renewables. And as the adults in the room, I feel like it's my generation's responsibility to do that. I don't want to give it to my kids or to my grandkids to take care of. So that's part of what motivates me and made me feel like the best investment I could make with the only $100,000 I've ever had is to invest into the air, food, and water of my community. And I'm emboldened in doing so by my own parents, who deeply conservative people who taught me a few things. My dad was a teenage combatant in World War II. And as far as he was concerned, even though he was really messed up by his experience and had what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, he still felt that was his finest achievement, that the job of his generation was to defeat global fascism. And at the time he was, shipped off to go up against German panzer tanks, it didn't look so good for our side. But as he said, when you have to do the right thing, you don't ask yourself, what are your chances of success? You just do the right thing, and you do it with your whole heart. So he was one of the people who, would quote Winston Churchill to me when I was young, we'll fight them on the beaches, we'll fight them in the streets, and we shall never surrender, right? And so that kind of fighting spirit comes back to me now when I look at people who seem to feel that that fracking is just inevitable and that it's a done deal. I don't think it is, but if we're passive and believe it is, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I actually think it is stoppable, and no matter what the odds of success are, if we can stop it, then I feel ethically, I feel obligated to do whatever I can, to bring whatever I can to the struggle. And then there's my mom, who was diagnosed about the same time that I was, when she had metastatic breast cancer. So we were co-cancer patients together. And her prognosis was always worse than mine. And she taught me the phrase, don't let them bury you until you're dead. That was the motto that she lived under. Now, my mom was like 46 when she was diagnosed. She's about to turn 82. She's outlived 3 oncologists and beat every prediction of her demise. So she is one of those 2% of women that's been living for more than 30 years with metastatic cancer, right? She's got tumor in her bones and her liver, but she just keeps going. So, and I fully recognize there are women who fought just as hard and valiantly as my mom who are non-survivors. But nevertheless, somebody's in that 2% of people, and it happens to be my mom. We could be the 2% of people who succeed in creating for ourselves an unfractured future for our children. And I believe that the whole world is watching us as we do this. Having just come from Washington County, Pennsylvania, where I gave a lecture to a room of hundreds of people, again, many people sobbing, whose community has been ruined. I never had so many people in my book signing line tell me how sick their children were with all these mysterious things. They can't live in their houses anymore, but they can't sell them either because the water's not potable. They're like sort of internal refugees who are just living, they can't live there anymore, so they're moved in with their sister and they don't know what they're going to do. And their message to me over and over was, New York is our only hope. If you can stop it there, maybe it will spread to other places. And so it stiffened my resolve even more in my belief that we happen to be in a place and a time where we have this opportunity to play a heroic role here in our own towns, in the same way that in 1930s in Europe, the French resistance and the partisans had to be the first ones to stop an atrocity. And eventually they had to call in people, there had to be Winston Churchills and Theodore Roosevelts, but it had to start with people in towns organizing and speaking out against an atrocity. And I feel like we're the ones. We have this incredible chance to be heroes. And I don't want to be a good German in this fight. I don't want to tell my children and grandchildren that I didn't know and didn't pay attention to what was going on. No matter how this turns out, I want to be able to say that I fought with everything I had for an unfractured future. So with that, thanks.
The librarian just informed me. Thank you, Sandra, first of all, that there's a 10-year-old boy back here writing a letter to Governor Cuomo.
If you can print it out, it would be wonderful to read.
She's going to help him print it, and maybe we can read it out later. So thank you very much for Sandra and Joe. And we have any questions for Sandra Steingraber? Come on up and use a microphone, please.
Hello, I just want to thank you. That was a fantastic speech. Thank you very much. I just would ask you to elaborate a little bit on evaporation pits. Obviously, the fluid, the water evaporates away, and if you could elaborate a little bit about what's left and what happens to what's left. Also, the air pollutants, when they come out of the ground, how long do they stay in our breathable air? What's the profile in terms of all that stuff? How long are we breathing that in? Thank you.
Those are good questions. Well, there's a big difference between east and west. And so fracking, as you know, was pioneered by Western companies, Halliburton being one. And so it was rolled out in places like Wyoming and Texas and Utah. So they have been fracking longer than we have here in the east. And so out west, where the humidity is low, evaporation pits was the original idea because things evaporate easily. So that's not necessarily going to be the solution here. So that's one of the peculiarities about this 1,537-page draft environmental impact statement that has been now revised, but still has no solution as to what will happen to that flowback. Because the plan for New York is not to simply create tons of pits and just let it evaporate, because it won't necessarily. It's not the desert. Pennsylvania tried running it through its sewage treatment plant, but it created massive public health issues because sewage treatment plants are very good at keeping out pathogens. They're not good at filtering out salts and things like bromine and things like that. So Pennsylvania is not going to do that anymore. To my understanding, running it through sewage treatment plants is not necessarily disallowed by these draft regulations. It's is that your understanding too, Joe? It's not disallowed. It doesn't really propose specific solutions to what we're going to do with this flowback. And the question then becomes, how much can we shove into the ground of Ohio? Which is already suffering from earthquakes just from Pennsylvania, right? So when I actually went to Stark County and I said, the official plan in New York is to bring it here where we're standing, people just started to weep. I mean, they had no idea that they were going to be actually receiving it from New York as well as Pennsylvania. So that's one of the very inelegant aspects of fracking, is not really knowing what to do with the flowback. Now, the other question is, how long are we going to breathe it? Well, different volatile chemicals have different lifespans once they're in sunlight and wind. Okay. That would be my 10-year-old. So we know from studies in out west that the smog that's created doesn't just stay in the gas patch. You find it 200 miles away. So we're almost certainly breathing in, maybe even right this second with every breath, chemicals from Pennsylvania's gas fields, because they're less than 200 miles from us. And so no one has looked at the cumulative impact of all of the emissions from Pennsylvania gas fields and then New York gas fields to know we could do that. We have very good models that could predict how much smog is created under certain circumstances. But we haven't done that yet. So cumulative impacts of air pollutants is not been quantified. Remember that air is an alchemist. It has its own way with these chemicals, so that when you have nitric oxides from exhaust pipes combining with the volatile organics, you create ground level ozone. That's what smog is. And when we see smog, we say we see this haze in the air. We're actually not seeing particles. We're seeing light waves bending. That's what makes it look blurry. These things are so small that they're completely microscopic. So the blurriness we see on a hazy day is just the bending light waves. And so the problem with ozone is it's a powerful cellular poison, and it punches holes in the alveoli of our lungs. That's the sort of business end of our lungs where the gas exchange actually takes place. An alveoli is 1/70th the width of a human hair. So the boundary between us and the atmosphere is 1/70th of a human hair. So we have an exquisite relationship with, you inhale a pint of atmosphere with every breath, and pretty much everything that's in that breath is going to go straight into your bloodstream. And if there's ozone in the air, it can punch a hole in those alveoli, and your lung tissue, unlike other organ systems of your body, can't repair itself. So you're basically aging your lungs through exposure to ozone. When children are exposed to lots of ozone when they're young, their lungs never grow as large as they would otherwise. And so we're actually shrinking the respiratory tract of children through lots of smog. So we have some data from Los Angeles, for example, showing that children in smoggy areas, when they become teenage athletes, it actually interferes with their performance because they just forevermore will have a smaller set of lungs. And the same is true if a pregnant woman is breathing crummy air. The respiratory tract of her child will never be as functional as it would otherwise. And we know with athletes who are running when there's smog, it interferes with performance. So you can't run as fast if you're breathing. I mean, there's just not as, your gas exchanges is not as efficient. So I hope that's the answer. So, did you want to read this? No. You want me to read it? Okay. This is my son Elijah, for whom my book, Raising Elijah, is named. Here's what he wrote. To Governor Cuomo, I am one of the millions of kids in New York. I am deeply concerned about the health effects of fracking. As I type this letter, my mother is in the other room fighting for a moratorium ban on hydrofracking in a small firehouse in the pretty village of Hector. I am told that it takes 1,000 trucks or more for one gas well. Do the math. If Chesapeake Energy wants 70,000 wells, that will mean there will be 70 million truck trips. Even I am fighting hard. I have spoken 4 times and even won an award. I think there are many more health effects of fracking, and I hope that you ban it. Thank you, Elijah D. Castro.
Do you have any data from Pennsylvania on the health effects of folks in Pennsylvania right now that are in the hydrofracking areas?
Yeah, okay. Let me pass. Raising Elijah was the last of 3 books I wrote on environmental health, and this one looks at environmental health threats on children. I didn't intend to write about fracking, but it became the last chapter in the book because fracking kind of broke on the scene as I was writing it. So in Pennsylvania, we have a hard time doing the science because of all of the non-disclosure agreements and the secrecy around it. But nevertheless, we know some things. But let me kind of explain that. So one of the unfortunate aspects of all of the exemptions that fracking enjoys is that the Safe Drinking Water Act mandates that if you are releasing chemicals into the shared environment that are inherently toxic, and you're not just confining them to the factory walls, but they're going out into the common environment, that the public has a right to know, and you have to release the name of those chemicals, right? But fracking is exempt from that, so the chemicals that are used in the fracking fluid and the chemicals released from the bedrock don't have to be divulged. And the fracking fluid itself can be considered proprietary trade secrets. So that makes it really hard on those of us in the public health community who might want to go in and do a health effects study. So, for example, if I go into a community, let's say New Jersey, which has a lot of Superfund sites because of toxic waste dumping in the past, and let's say there are a lot of kids with brain tumors, and the community is really interested to know whether or not there are excess brain tumor rates or excess birth defects or preterm birth or something like that, and perhaps it's related to the release of a chemical. Well, there are things I can do. I can go into the cancer registry data and the birth defects registry data, and then I can go into the toxics release inventory and take a look at where the toxic waste sites are, what's in the chemicals and what's in the water, and then figure out if there's a pattern or not. But in a case where there's all kinds of secrecy, then it's tough because you can have a lot of sick people and not know what they're being exposed to. So if you see increased rates of miscarriage, how do you know whether it's related to something or not, because you don't know what the something is? So that's the problem. Nevertheless, some of the researchers right here in Cornell, Michelle Bamberger, the veterinarian, and Robert Oswald, biochemist, have been working in Pennsylvania in a case study way and have published in the journal New Solutions, just a kind of peer-reviewed environmental policy journal, their results of looking at people who have animals. So they looked at health effects in people and then looked at their animals, including livestock, horses, and companion animals, to see if there were commonalities. And in some cases, they were able to find things. And in some cases, there were kind of natural experiments. For example, frac fluid got into one stream where 80 cows were pastured, but not in another stream where another group of cows were pastured. And then you could take a look to see whether or not the cows that had exposure to frac fluid had more problems, more stillbirths, contaminated milks, things like that. And in some cases, they were able to find things. But this is on a case study basis rather than a kind of controlled experiment the way we would like to see it done. The other problem in Pennsylvania is related to the one that Joe mentioned. The same law that removed home rule also made it very difficult for physicians of individual patients to get information on what people are exposed to. So if a doctor is, if a patient comes into a doctor with a bunch of mysterious problems and the doctor feels like, I need to know what this person's exposed to, let's say they live in the middle of a gas field, the doctor can go to the company and ask for the secret ingredients in the fracking fluid, but they have to sign a non-disclosure agreement. So the physician can use that information to treat the patient, but then that's where it's supposed to stop. And here's where it gets very muddy, because a physician has ethical responsibilities not just to treat patients, but to prevent harm in communities. That's part of a doctor's job. And so in normal circumstances, if the doctor began to see something strange happening to a patient or two, they would alert the public. They would call the radio station. They would write up a case study for New England Journal of Medicine. They would talk to their Board of Public Health. I mean, that's how we discovered that HIV was the causative agent for AIDS, right? And we had doctors saying, I have gay men who all have these weird diseases, and they were in bathhouses. And so it was that's how they began to piece it together. That's how we discovered that rubella caused congenital blindness in babies, right? So when babies are born and they're blind from cataracts, if their mothers were exposed to German measles, that German measles is one of the very few things that can pass through the placenta as a virus and cause a birth defect. And it was an Australian ophthalmologist who figured that out, because he reported to the medical literature about these patients of his, these babies that were born with congenital blindness who lived next to military facilities where there had been outbreaks of rubella, and he wondered if anybody else in the world had seen that connection. And then as doctors began to talk to each other, they pieced the cause and effect together. So public health often relies on the observations of individual doctors treating individual patients. So it's not really clear how it's called Act 13, it's going to play out in Pennsylvania. But those of us who do research in public health and rely on physicians being the sentries to tell us, what's going on. I mean, I rely on physicians all the time to say, who might call me up and say, I've got all these patients I'm treating for, let's say, childhood patients for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and they all are living in the same zip code. What's going on there? Are they all using a pesticide? What kind of agriculture do they do? That's just part of the hypothesis generating work that we do. So the veil of secrecy in Pennsylvania is amazing to me. I've never quite seen anything like it. I even had a physician the other night in my audience come up to me and ask what I thought he should do. And so I just hope that is never our situation here.
I want to thank both of you for coming. Is this on? Oh, okay. I want to thank both of you for coming. And I have a question about this other process of fracking using petroleum products, and what you know about that and the hazards there, or the benefits, I suppose.
Why don't you try?
The first time I heard about trying to extract one fossil fuel with another fossil fuel that we've already extracted and already used up a great deal of energy to separate and produce, it just is illogical. And I think that the carbon footprint of that process has to be even worse than what Dr. Howarth and Graffia have documented for fracking with water. So it's just counterintuitive that this is an answer to the problem of how we can extract this gas. What we've learned in the couple of weeks that it's been out there, really, and that's about what it is, maybe it's about a month, is that all of the information that we hear about it comes from the company that says it's a good thing. They still have to use a whole lot of chemicals in order to frack for almost all of the same reasons that Sandra laid out. And so again, where are we going with this process of using one fossil fuel that we've already extracted and ruined some other area or ruined our area? And there are just a lot of unknowns about it. It's too new. I think I read an article within the last couple of days that at least the DEC recognizes that this has to have a very, very careful analysis before they can even consider it. It's not a cure-all. I think what we're going to find in the weeks ahead is that there are very many problems with it. We know there have been 2 very, very serious accidents in Canada where it's been employed. It's obviously more dangerous. Those of us who have propane tanks at our house know that that's a very risky thing. You want to know where the shut-off valve is, things like that. I think this is just grasping at straws, and that what we're going to see within the next few months is that this is not at all the answer. The answers are what we've talked about before. Sustainable energy. It just seems to be going even further in the wrong direction into the using fossil fuels, and then one other fossil fuel to produce this fossil fuel. I just don't see how that's going to make sense in the long run. You may know more about it.
No, yeah, it's called, propane fracking. And my understanding is that because of the dangers of it, it's done mostly robotically, right? And so because of the risk of explosion, it does obviate the need for use of water. But it's highly explosive. So I guess all of these extreme energy extraction techniques really kind of come down to the fact that we don't have, these are things you can't test out in a laboratory, right? I mean, I'm a biologist who's used to lab data. So before you deploy a new chemical or a new drug, you test it out in the laboratory, and then you bring it out into the real world fairly slowly. And I have a lot of critiques about how we test chemicals before they're allowed to be marketed. But with energy extraction, we don't have a spare planet to try these things out on, right? And improve the technique and keep doing it better and learn from our mistakes, because everywhere we drill is somebody's backyard, is somebody's home, is somebody's community. And so we're guinea pigging this thing in Pennsylvania. You know, we rolled it out, and now we're seeing health effects, and now we're trying to go in and understand what the health effects are, even though people are in litigation, there's secrecy, we can't get the data. And it amazes me as a biologist, because I'm actually pretty good at animal surgery. I don't do it anymore, but the reason I'm good at animal surgery is because you don't do experiments on human beings. You do them on animals, right? And so that's not what we're doing here. We're doing experiments on human beings. And we're doing it in an uncontrolled way, using our communities as laboratories, building drill rigs right next to schools, hauling chemicals and building waste pits right next to churches and in communities and right where we grow our food. And so it's an outdoor laboratory in the places that we live. And the morality of that is like nothing else I've ever seen as a scientist.